Welcome, I'm Terry Soul, and this is Programming Chaos, a channel devoted to programming projects that you can use to hone your programming skills. It's springtime when I'm recording this, so as you can see, I thought I would do some procedurally generated flowers. It's always nice to have a way to add a little spot of color to your projects. I'm starting here with a little bit of what I think of as processing boilerplate. So the setup and draw function, setting the size of the window, and switching to the hue, saturation, brightness, color mode, which will be handy for doing these flowers. Now, in order to design the flowers, we have to think about, well, how are they being drawn? What constructs a flower? And you can look at the examples I have here, think about sort of real flowers, but in general, they're made up of a series of petals going around and then often more petals inside of that. So think about things like daisies or sunflowers or roses. There are other flowers that are less symmetric, but we'll stick with sort of the symmetric rings of petals as our flower. And what I want to start with then is to draw just a single ring of petals, and I'll do those as ellipses. So it's actually going to be a ring of ellipses. And I'll do it as a separate class, so we'll have a class for our flowers. So there we go. So this means that each flower can be its own object, and each of those flower objects can have its own parameters so that the flowers all look different, as you could see before. So the question becomes, well, what parameters do our flowers need? Well, if we're thinking in terms of a ring of ellipses, there's a few things we can start with. How many petals should there be in a ring? So sort of a petal count. What should the color of the petals be? So a hue. And then what should the size of the petals be? So how long and how wide? And I'll do width as a fraction of length. And so we'll start by making those the data members of our class. So there we go. Those are the four data members that I talked about. The count of the petals, the color, the length, and the width. And now that we have the data members defined, I'll create a constructor to assign them all random values. And I'll pick sort of arbitrary random ranges to begin with. And this is always something that you can play with if you want. So there we go. There's our constructor. And so the hue is a random value from 0 to 360 because I'm using a full color wheel. The petal count is interesting. I decided I wanted multiples of 4. So I did a random integer, because I want an integer number of petals, between 2 and 8, and then multiplied that by 4. So that'll actually give me between 8 and 32 petals in a ring. And then the length is a random value between 1 and 100, so pretty long petals, and the width will be between 20 and 50% of the length, so narrower than they are wide. So that sets up the data members for our class, and now the next thing I need to do then is display them. So here's my display function. I'm going to have my petals outlined with a black stroke around the edge. And that's something that you can play with if you want. And then basically I need to draw my ellipses going around in a circle. And so I'm going to need a for loop that loops around placing each petal. And as it loops, it rotates my coordinate system. And the trick is to know how much to rotate the coordinate system by. Well, the whole circle is 2 pi. I need to divide that by the number of petals I have. So delta A is going to be the change in angle as I move around the circle. And I'll divide that by the petal count to get the right number of petals. And now I just need my for loop to loop around and draw them. There we go. So my angle starts at 0. Actually, for processing, that would be in this direction and then goes around 2 pi. And this is a little unusual for a for loop in that I'm not using an integer to say count from 1 to 10. I'm using a floating point, but that's fine. It's still the same idea. I start at some value, in this case 0, and count up to some value. I'm just not counting by integers. So now that I have the for loop, what I want to do is rotate by that angle and then draw my ellipse. And I'm actually going to rotate not by the angle, but by the delta angle. So each time I rotate a little further. And I need to make sure that I fill the ellipse with the right color. So there we go. I'm filling with the hue and maximum brightness and saturation to get nice bright flowers. You could play with that if you want sort of gloomier flowers. And then the ellipse is centered at 0, 0. So I'm going to have to, when I call the flower function, translate to the right location on the screens that I want the flower drawn at. And then it's the length and the width. And the only thing I need to be careful of here is to do this rotation, because I'm rotating a little fraction each time. I need to store my transformation matrix with a push matrix and then pop it back off. And in this case, that comes outside of the for loop. So I'm storing the old coordinate system by pushing it onto a stack, and then I'm going to progressively rotate it, draw an ellipse, rotate it, draw an ellipse, rotate and draw an ellipse. And it's only after I'm done drawing all the ellipses that I will pop it back off the stack. So there we go, that's our display function. So now I can generate a flower with the constructor to give it random values, and I can display it. And so time to go back to the main code and put all that together. I need a flower object, I'll just call it F1. I'll construct my new flower, so that sets all those random values. I'm going to set the frame rate very slow, 1 frame per second, because in the draw loop, I'm going to keep generating new random flowers so that we can see a little bit of the procedural generation variety we can get. So I'll clear the background each time, ask each flower to display itself, and then I'll go ahead and generate a new flower. So every second as we loop through, we'll see a new flower. So here we go. And I forgot my coordinate transformation, so let's do that. There we go. So now each flower will be drawn in the middle because I'm translating to the center of the screen. So there you go. We can see we're drawing a circle of ellipses, maybe not quite what you expected because they're all centered in the center. But you can see where this might be the start of a flower, but what would probably be better is to offset them so they're out along the edge as we move around. So that's easy enough to do. We simply have to move along the x-axis when we draw them. So it turns out if we do it by length, which might be our first inclination, so I'm basically taking the ellipse which was drawn in the center and pushing it out along the x-axis, we get that, which is not at all bad. So that is sort of our ring of petals. We have a hole in the middle, but what we want to do is fill those in with more petals. So I'm going to sort of move in from the center with another set of petals drawn in the middle, but they may not overlap well. So, and this is something you can experiment with, but I found that not pushing them out quite that far tends to make a nicer, more compact flower. So instead of length, I'll go 75% of the length. And now you can see they're a little more tightly packed, which is going to be useful as we fill in the rest of the flower. The other thing you'll notice is the last petal we draw doesn't quite fit in right. So when they overlap, you can see there's one that is sort of not overlapping properly, and it's the last one that gets drawn. I'm not going to worry about fixing that because it's fairly tricky to do, and once we fill in the rest of the flower, it'll be much harder to see. So the next piece we need to do is draw not just one ring of petals, but a whole set of petals, and they're going to get closer to the center of the flower and also probably smaller. That tends to work better. So I want to do this by adding more variation to the flowers. So we have a petal count. I'm going to add to that a row count. So that's the number of rows of petals that we have. And we'll add that to the constructor. And I want it to be a random integer, and it's sort of up to you how many rows that you want. I'll do, let's say, between 4 and 10. So now we have to figure out how to display those rows. Well, this part of the code here is what draws one row of flowers. And so I want to take that loop and nest it inside another loop that counts in for the rows. And so the general idea will be, I'm going to count the number of rows, and this will be an integer because I have an integer number of rows, from r equals 0, as long as that's less than the row count. And Each time I'll increase it by 1, then we can fix our spacing. Always important to do because it makes the code much more readable, and I was using R for my variable here. So now instead of one set of ellipses, I'll get multiple rows of ellipses. Currently though, they'll all be stacked on top of each other, so I need, as I go through the rows, to move in. So to move in, effectively what I want to do is make the petals smaller, and because the position they're drawn at is based on the length, simply making the petals smaller will be enough to move them in towards the center of the flower as well. So I'm going to do that by creating a new variable. I'll call it petal length or petal len, and I'll make that equal to the length of the petal. And initially that is the length that we'll use. So I'm just going to put in here the petal length and here as well. So this doesn't change the code at all, but it does allow me to say every time I loop through, let's make the petals a little smaller. And so this is how I'll do that. Each loop, the petals get 10% smaller, so they're 90% of their old length. And this won't work perfectly. We can fiddle with the math a bit, but it's a good place to start. So there you go. You can see now we've got not just one petal, but a whole series of them coming in towards the center. And the issue here is they're maybe not shrinking by quite enough. And so I spent some time trying to figure out math that would make them look better. And this is what I came up with. So this looks a little odd, but the idea is I'm going to multiply by 1, so that'll leave the length the same, but I'm subtracting from that 3 divided by the row count. And so the more rows I have, the smaller amount that I'm subtracting from that. So there you can see the petals, as they go in, they get smaller as they go, and so they fill in the center pretty well. Now, one thing you'll notice that I'm not a huge fan of is the petals are all perfectly lined up on the way in, and you can see that especially when there are fewer of them. They perfectly line up. And so one way to change that is for each row, after we draw one row, we'll then rotate our coordinate system a little bit. So I'll add one more variable, call that rotate. And I'm rotating it in radians, so this is actually a fairly small looking number between 0 and 1.0. But in terms of radians, that's a pretty big shift. And again, you can adjust those bounds if you want. And the idea is simply after we finish drawing one row, so in the code, this draws one row or one circle of petals. After I draw that, I'm going to want to rotate by the given amount. So rotate by that variable. And it occurs to me rotate was not the best name because this is confusing, but processing can figure out where I'm calling the function and where I'm calling the variable just based on the parentheses. So now notice that they're not perfectly lined up. That one was, but in some cases we'll see them off center a bit. Maybe I want a bigger range for my rotate. So instead of starting at 0, I'll start at 0.5 and go to say 2. And that will force them all to rotate a bit. There you go. You can sort of see that twisting as they draw around. Good. Now the only issue I have with this is they still look very flat because they're all drawn with exactly the same color. And so there's two ways we can change that. One is change the color of the petals as we move towards the center just by adjusting the hue based on which row we're in. So if that didn't entirely make sense, the idea is when I go to fill them in, instead of filling in with just the hue, I could do something like fill in with the hue minus the value of R times, say, 5. Remember, my hue goes from 0 to 360, and my R is my row count. It only goes up to a maximum of 10, so subtracting 10 wouldn't be much. This subtracts as much as 50. Maybe too much, but it's a good place to start. So now notice each row of petals is slightly different colored, and in fact, that's maybe not as strong as I'd like. Let's make that a 20. There we go. Now you can see in some cases that nice bright transformation as we move in through the rows. And I'm subtracting. Probably a better way to do this is to add because then we can do a mod 360 in case we get all the way around the color wheel. That'll start over at the beginning. So that adds a little more depth to our flowers. And you'll notice sometimes there's gaps in them, and we could adjust that by changing, for example, how much the petals shrink by as we go. But generally, it's pretty good. Always a trade-off with procedural generation. The more randomness you get, that is, the bigger the range of variability you allow, the more likely you are to get something that looks a little bizarre occasionally. But it's a fair trade-off. So the last issue that I have with this is the petals themselves are very flat looking. And that's because they're simply drawn as a single filled in ellipse. And what I would like to do is to make the petals look different individually. And the way I'll accomplish that is quite similar to what I'm doing here. I'm going to, instead of drawing a single ellipse for a petal, I'm going to draw a whole series of ellipses. Each one is slightly smaller and each one is a slightly different color. So it's the same idea of drawing rows that are smaller in different colors, but I'll apply it to individual petals. And in this case, in terms of designing the code, I do not want to do yet another for loop inside of my nested for loops, because that would start getting very complicated. Instead, I'm going to create a separate function to draw the petals. So let's do that. There we go. So instead of calling the ellipse function here, I will eventually call the petal function. But in order to call the petal function, the petal needs to know where to draw itself, how big it should be, and what hue it should have. So I need to pass in those variables. And again, I'm using the same length that I used for the class as a whole, which is probably not a great idea. So I'll just call this length P and width P, and let's make this hue P to remind me that these are part of the petal function and not part of the global class. And I'll pass them in. Like I say, instead of drawing an ellipse, I'll draw a cool looking petal. So to draw my petals, I need to, again, have a for loop, and I'm going to, in a sense, count down from the biggest outside petal down to the smaller inside petals, or down to the center of the petal. And I'm going to do that in 20 steps. The number of steps is up to you. More steps will give a smoother gradation, but will also take a little more time to draw. So I'm going to do a total of 20, and I'm thinking of starting at the largest size. So I'll start with 20, and like I say, count backwards. So as I move towards the center, I want to fill with the hue, but as I move in, I also want to change it a little bit. So I'll change it based on I times 2. This is the same idea I did for the different rows, but it's a smaller change because I want the change to be more subtle when it comes to the petals. And again, I'll do a mod 360 so that if I happen to go around the color wheel, I'll come back to the beginning. And then maximum saturation, but also to get a nice sense of depth, I'm going to make the center of the petal darker as I go. So the brightness will be 5 times I. I is 20, so originally I'll have full brightness 100, and then as I move towards the center, it'll get darker and darker. So the center of each petal will look a little darker, and as you'll see, that gives a nice sense of depth. And now I can draw my ellipse. It's at location XY. The length is the total length, but as I get smaller, I want the length to get smaller. So I'm using I divided by 20 as a factor on the length. So initially I is 20. This is just 1, so it's full length. But then as I goes to 19 and 18 and 17, this value gets smaller. And so I'm drawing smaller versions of the petal. And then the same thing. The width is also times I divided by 20. And notice that I'm doing 20.0. I is an integer. In order to avoid truncation of integer division, which would just give me a bunch of zeros, I have to make sure one of these numbers is treated as a floating point. So there we go. One other trick that you would stumble upon probably on your own, but I'll go ahead and just put it in, is I only want an outline around the outer leaf. I don't want outlines, or excuse me, the outline around the outer petal. I don't want outlines as I go. So after I draw the first ellipse, I'm going to turn the stroke off. And that means before I start the for loop, I need to put the stroke at 0. So I'll start with my first petal having the outline around it, and then the rest will have no stroke. And now the last thing I have to do is, instead of calling the ellipse function, I'm going to call the petal function, which is my own version, if you will, of ellipse. And the location is exactly the same, and in fact the size is exactly the same, so I can just copy those over. But I'm not using this fill anymore, so I need to borrow this hue so that I can also tell the petal what hue that it should draw itself in. And that means I don't need this one anymore. I'll comment it out in case I want to come back to it later. So now, instead of drawing just simple ellipses, I'm drawing a whole series of ellipses that are getting smaller and changing color. Let's see. I am short 1 parenthesis. There we go. And those do not look correct at all. And the reason, which you may have noticed as I was typing, is because I was using the length and the width, not the arguments that I passed in, not the length p, but instead just the width. So let's fix that and see if we get a slightly better version. Not that this isn't sort of cool looking. Happy accident, as they say. There we go, much better. And so here you can see, as we get towards the center of the petal, it gets darker and a slightly different hue, and that gives it a much better sense of depth. So these start to look a little bit like 3D flowers because you can sort of see the shading on them. Excellent. One more trick to make them stand out a bit that I thought I would mention, and that is our background is very gray, and I'm not great with colors, but I do know that we can get better contrast by using complementary colors, which are basically 180 degrees around the color wheel. So I'm going to come over here and change the background. And what I want to do is use the hue of the flower, but I'm going to pick the complementary color. So I'm going to add 180 to that, and then as before, mod 360, so I go all the way around the color wheel properly. And I want this not very saturated, so I'm only going to use 10% saturation. So this will make a very faint color, but I'll leave it nice and bright. So it'll be close to white, but it'll have a little tinge of the complementary color to the flower. And that, as you'll see, makes it pop just a little bit. And so each time it draws the flower, it also changes the background to sort of match. So this gives us one flower at a time drawn in the middle of the screen, which is a nice way to test that we like our parameters. And if you don't like them, if these are too dark or you want more rings of petals, of course you can go in and change the parameters all you want. But it's also nice to say, well, now that I have a good range of flowers, let's just draw a bunch of them all over the screen. So it turns out that's pretty easy to do. Instead of translating to the middle of the screen, I'll just pick a random location. And because these flowers were drawn very big to sort of fill the screen, they might be too big. So I'm also going to scale them a bit. There we go. So these are going to be between 30 and 50% of the full-sized flowers. And I'm going to get rid of the background altogether because I don't want to erase the old ones. I just want to keep adding. And so there we go. We can fill the screen with flowers if we want. And in fact, to make this go a little faster because I'm impatient, I'll get rid of the frame rate, and now it'll fill it in as fast as it can. There you go. Lots and lots of beautiful flowers. Again, we can go in and adjust the parameters to sort of get them more the way we want. If you don't want these green looking flowers, you could adjust the random hue to leave the green out of the color wheel. You can adjust the number of rows that you can have, the number of petals per row, all of that. Adding a stem or maybe some leaves in the background could be nice. Another excellent thing you can do with this is combine it with different projects. So for example, I have another video where you draw trees. Well, now we have flowers. So in the tree video, we put a leaf or a round fruit at the end of each branch. We could now draw trees and put a flower at the end of each branch. And that's very easy to do because the flower is its own class. We simply take this code for the flower class, paste it into the tree program, and when we get to the end of the branch of a tree, we ask it to draw a flower there. The transformations are already in place. The classes are already in place. It all works surprisingly easily. Okay, thank you.